This story begins in 1985, when a young Akitoshi Kawazu was hired at Square Enix to work as a graphic designer on Rad Racer. After that game, Hironobu Sakaguchi asked Akitoshi Kawazu to work on developing Final Fantasy as its battle designer, a role he would carry into the development of Final Fantasy II, the game that served as the foundation for his long and storied career at Square Enix. Unlike Final Fantasy I and the Dragon Quest series, which pioneered the JRPG genre, Kawazu developed a unique battle system in Final Fantasy II where characters increased in strength based on in-battle action usage statistics and events. A stark difference to the popular post-battle level-ups after the accumulation of enough experience points that featured in most JRPGs for the following decades. His battle system initially confused players, and games continuing on from Final Fantasy III reverted back to the more straightforward experience point system. Final Fantasy II could be seen as Kawazu's earliest demonstration of a design philosophy that always tried something new and challenged the perceived limitations of RPGs. While Final Fantasy II is probably one of the least popular Final Fantasy games in the series, with many people calling it one of the worst Final Fantasy games, its battle system began a legacy that was refined and developed in Kawazu's future games. A legacy of challenging games with increasing complexity that many might describe as containing obfuscating mechanics as well. Those diligent enough to master the obfuscating mechanics might even find these challenging games to be easy. With the release of the Game Boy, Kawazu was put in charge of directing and designing the system's first RPG, Akitoshi SaGa, known in the West as the Final Fantasy Legend, and the very first game in the SaGa series, the first and longest running Final Fantasy spin-off series. This game was hugely successful and was Squaresoft's first title to sell 1 million copies, outperforming, believe it or not, even Squaresoft's flagship Final Fantasy series in its early years in sales numbers. He went on to develop Final Fantasy Legend 2 before Nintendo themselves actually requested he work on Romancing Saga for the Super Famicom after seeing the stellar success of the Final Fantasy Legend on the Game Boy. Final Fantasy Legend 3 was developed by an external studio without Kawazu's involvement, but retained a lot of his unique design aspects when it came to the battle system and character strength development. In addition to inheriting Final Fantasy II's strength progression system, the Final Fantasy Legend games also had weapon durability and several races of characters to choose from, beginning with humans, mutants, and monsters in the first game, and eventually adding robots to the mix, each with their own special characteristics and ways of gaining strength in the game. Romancing Saga was Kawazu's most ambitious game yet, and introduced series mainstays Tomomi Kobayashi as character designer and Kenji Ito as the series' main composer. Although Kenji Ito did do work as a co-composer for Final Fantasy Legend 2's soundtrack beforehand. Kawazu was director, lead designer, and scenario writer. Masafumi Miyamoto, the founder and former president of Square, produced the game. Yoshinori Kitase, who later became famous for his work on the Final Fantasy series, created the game's world map. Tetsuya Takahashi, who later directed Xenogears and Xenoblade Chronicles, was one of several graphic designers working on the game. One could argue this game was developed by the Dream Team before they became even more famous than Akitoshi Kawazu. Kenji Ito's soundtrack, even for this original version of Romancing Saga, was just as good as Nobuo Uematsu's work on the Final Fantasy series at the time, which is to say, it was excellent. Nintendo themselves actually requested for Square to develop this game in 1990 for the Super Famicom while it was still in production. That's how much faith Nintendo had in Akitoshi Kawazu to create a system-selling masterpiece for their new Super Famicom. Romancing Saga continued the series' tradition of foregoing experience points for action-based attribute and skill development. The mutants, robots, and monster party members were gone, and the setting was more akin to the Middle Ages. The game's free scenario system developed the game's narrative through a complex event system in an open world. The player's path through the game is not only defined by one of the 8 possible choices of protagonists at the beginning, but also where the player decides to go next in the open world, who they talk to, and which events were previously triggered. Among the recruitable characters are also the 7 other protagonists that the player didn't select. Romancing Saga was also the beginning of this series' increasing battle complexity, introducing formations and distance mechanics that had effects on weapon damage done and received for characters. Abilities used battle points, and when weapons were used enough, characters could unlock increasingly strong special weapon skills for use in battles. The Romancing Saga series was one of the first, if not the first, turn-based JRPG series to introduce another feature that was ahead of its time in 1992, and that was the ability to see enemies as symbol encounters on the map as opposed to the random encounters in most other JRPGs of the time. On the Super Famicom hardware with low frame rates, this came at a price as characters would lag a bit when moving, and sometimes monsters were totally packed into spaces so narrow you'd almost wish the game had random encounters, because you were running into an enemy every step you would take anyways. I remember when the Romancing Saga 2 remaster came west and people actually thought the game had terrible input lag for moving, but it was just faithful recreation of how the game actually played on the Super Famicom. The game probably would have been more popular in the West if this was fixed to be more fluid, but personally I was just grateful to be able to play the game and support Square Enix. Enix by buying it. Here in 2023, we take the smooth implementation of symbol encounters for granted in most modern RPGs, but back then it was a big deal despite its weak implementation. While most people prefer symbol encounters these days, I have my own thoughts on the matter, but that's a topic for another video. Sadly, Romancing Saga, like Final Fantasy II, was not localized for Western audiences. In fact, as someone living in the 90s, I'd even go so far as to say the Romancing Saga series as a whole was almost invisible to the Western market. Even Live Alive got some Western press, even though it never got an official release here. Final Fantasy II at least got an eventual official localization, piggybacking off the strength of the Final Fantasy brand after Final Fantasy VII's explosive release. I didn't even know what Romancing Saga was until I played the remake in 2005. Currently, the Super Famicom version of Romancing Saga can only be played in English with a fan translation. However, even with its Japanese exclusivity, Romancing Saga saw explosive sales across its lifetime exceeding 1.1 million units. This game probably sold quite a bit of Super Famicoms in Japan. While these numbers are impressive, Romancing Saga was actually only the 5th best-selling game in the Saga franchise. These sales make me wonder how many more copies this game could have sold if it were released in the West on the Super Nintendo. Just inserting my own opinions here as someone who was enjoying JRPGs in the 90s, I have actually played the fan-translated version of Romancing Saga, and the game is definitely very different compared to Final Fantasy IV and even the Final Fantasy Legend games, as it didn't feature additional races with unique characteristics. It was just humans and humanoids. As a youth, I can say I would have unquestionably enjoyed Final Fantasy IV more, as its mechanics and storytelling are far more straightforward. But as an adult who has experienced far too many experience point-based leveling systems in RPGs, I learned to appreciate complex battle systems and more player agency and storytelling. I think the game would have been talked about and appreciated at least as much as the Mana series and the Final Fantasy Legend games that were brought west. The original Romancing Saga wasn't as prohibitively complex as a lot of more modern Saga games are. Romancing Saga's free scenario system encouraged multiple playthroughs without a New Game Plus feature. Every playthrough of the game felt unique and different, which is something nobody can say about any flagship Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest title, or any other JRPG at that time for that matter. Kawazu, Tomomi, and Ito continued work on Romancing Saga 2 with an almost entirely new team of developers, since most of the original Romancing Saga team were moved over to develop Final Fantasy V. Romancing Saga 2 took the focus off of multiple protagonists and onto a single dynastic emperor, and unlike Romancing Saga 1, in which a single dark god, Saruin, was the sole villain, Romancing Saga 2 introduced 7 villains who used to be heroes. The game progresses through a similar open world system to Romancing Saga, however important events would progress the time in the game's world by many years. Romancing Saga 2 has perhaps one of the craziest gameplay loops in a JRPG ever, as completing important events in the story, like defeating one of the main antagonists, would result in time advancing so far that your current emperor would die, and leave behind a successor that inherits the skill levels developed by their predecessor. If the player's party wiped, it would also trigger a new successor to appear and inherit their skills. Due to the sheer number of characters, a player would have to die or loop over 300 times to ultimately lose the game, but on the game's final loop, where they are controlling the character they choose at the beginning, it is possible to game over if you're not careful. This loop meant you were constantly recruiting and equipping new characters between generations, and possibly changing battle strategies to accommodate for the new party members too. Your choice of characters to recruit between generations also depended on events and choices made in the game. As Emperor or Empress, players would have to fund the development of new equipment and spells. The more land players controlled from completing events, the more money they would get from battling enemies. Making new classes recruitable also increased the selection of formations to employ in battle, which were also more important in Romancing Saga 2 than in prior entries. While Romancing Saga 2 wasn't critically received nearly as well as Romancing Saga, it went on to become the best-selling entry in the Romancing Saga series to a tune of over 1.5 million lifetime sales in Japan as of 2003. Again, the game never received an official localization until several decades later as a remaster in 2015. I've only personally completely played through the official localized remaster of this game twice, and while I really enjoy the game, I do think the original Romancing Saga 1 and 3 are just better games overall. The multiple protagonists in those games just create more replayability, but I do love the design of the 7 villains in the game, and I feel it's pretty awesome when you finally get to control your chosen character on the last loop to finally complete the game too. My biggest problem with Romancing Saga 2 was that as cool as it was to play a game across hundreds of years and multiple generations of emperors, the constant reshuffling and menuing involved with recruiting and re-equipping new party members after wipes really ruined the pacing of the game for me. Also, I'd say it's the most challenging game in the series, so going into the game blind without understanding the basics will definitely result in constant scuffed formations and wipes. Despite these issues, I ultimately still enjoyed the game enough for 2 playthroughs, and I could see myself going back for a third in the future with a totally different party. Similar to Romancing Saga, Romancing Saga 3 begins with a choice of 1 protagonist out of 8, along with some additional choices that affect stats and weapon specializations for your main character. Romancing Saga 3 inherits the second game's rich choice of formations with their special bonuses, but also introduces an innovative commander mode that content allows players to put their main character in a 6th rank, and define strategies that the rest of their party will automatically follow without the player's command input. Romancing Saga 3 also pioneered the SaGa series' iconic sparking or glimmer system to the series that was retroactively added to later remakes and remasters of earlier games in the SaGa series. This extremely fun battle mechanic allows characters to learn weapon and defensive techniques on the fly in the middle of battle according to actions used in battle. It could completely turn around seemingly hopeless situations in very challenging fights in the most awesome ways possible. This small addition to the battle system really gave the game's battle systems their character, in my opinion. Skills could also be sparked in the automated commander mode, creating flashy multi-techs that are quite similar in aesthetics to the double and triple techs seen in later games like Chrono Trigger. The sparking of these multi-tech skills depends on factors like which weapons and spells your team has equipped, as well as their formation and their position within these formations. The game also has multi-magic options with powerful spells unlocked through the completion of parts of the game's main story. Like Romancing Saga 2, the game features a rich variety of weapon types, all with a wide variety of skills to spark through extensive use. The game also features a spell system that allows characters to learn a school of terrestrial and celestial magic. In addition to more developed gameplay systems, there's also a fun business minigame that's good for earning money. The strategic battle minigame also exists, which I still don't completely understand after hundreds of hours playing this game, but that's more important in specific characters' stories if you select them as the protagonist. While the game is loaded with fun, complex systems, a player could get by completely without using commander mode and just have fun sparking skills on their character's favorite weapons and otherwise just play the game like a traditional JRPG with whatever they use getting stronger with each use. Of course, this game wasn't officially released in the West either, until its remaster arrived over 2 decades later in 2019, adding a dungeon with some clarifying story scenes. I personally fell in love with the game after playing the fan translation and was really happy the game got an official localization with some new features down the line. Sony jumped in to publish SaGa Frontier in 1997 in the West for the PlayStation, which was actually the game's first use of the term Saga in the West, with the last game in the series released West being Final Fantasy Legend 3 on the Game Boy many years prior. Compared to Romancing Saga 3, it cut back on the weapon variety to swords, guns, and martial arts. Sparking new weapon or martial arts attacks is limited to human characters. Commander mode and all the fun that came with it was also removed, but characters in SaGa Frontier could still combine their attacks. SaGa Frontier was actually my first entry into the SaGa series, as I missed out on the Final Fantasy Legend titles in their heyday, only having gone back to those titles after experiencing the fan translations of their remakes many years later. While SaGa Frontier did remove the weapon variety and formation techs, monsters and robots came back from the Final Fantasy Legends games as potential party members along with mystics who play a lot like the mutants did in the Final Fantasy Legends. Robots improved according to their equipment, and robot enemy data downloaded after defeating them could allow them to learn new skills. Monsters could fuse with anything they defeated to create stronger or weaker monsters depending largely on a complex mix of the skills that they have and their max hit points. Mystics could absorb enemies into their equipment to obtain higher stats and special skills. Mystics also have 4 slots for spells. Humans are fully customizable for magic or weapon skills and could spark new skills through sword or martial arts use. Outside of martial arts, the game featured only 2 weapon types, guns and swords. There are also special curved swords for characters to spark a special class of sword techniques. The game also had a deeper magic system with 5 categories of magic composing of 2 opposing types each. Any human or mystic could only learn one type from each category, with one awesome story character exception. SaGa Frontier is probably the easiest modern SaGa game to get into, and it's the one I recommend to anybody who has never played a SaGa game before and is looking to get into it. The very recently released remaster is playable on just about every platform and contains features that make the game much easier for newcomers to get into. For veterans, they added new content and kept in a lot of the more fun exploits too. The different selectable main characters represent the variety of available races. They have very independent stories from each other, but share the same open world and common locations within their stories. Many of them have exclusive battle and character recruitment options within their own scenarios as well, meaning each main character can have a very different gameplay experience, even compared to other SaGa games. The most complex parts of the game's gameplay probably lie with mechanics behind monsters and multiple character combination attacks. My favorite thing about SaGa Frontier is definitely the set pieces made possible by the characters' very distinct stories. I can remember the climactic scene before the final dungeon of Blue's Quest, Aselus's final boss, and the lead up to Amelia's final boss, just as easily as I remember Final Fantasy VI's opera scene. The game's regions all looked and felt very different from each other too, which is something I missed in recent games like SaGa Scarlet Grace. For SaGa Frontier 2, Kenji Ito was replaced by Masashi Hamauzu. The game featured 2 main characters and continued the SaGa tradition of open world exploration and action-based skill progression from previous games in the series. SaGa Frontier 2 also had a dueling system for one-on-one combat and a strategic option to involve more characters in the action. The game actually reviewed very well, but I personally found it to have less replay value than the other SaGa games, largely because of the dual protagonist system. I think the lack of character variety had a lot to do with this too, since robots, monsters, and mystics were no longer a thing either. People really liked the game though. It's also worth noting that there was a leak and rumor recently that Square Enix is working on a remaster of SaGa Frontier 2, so I wouldn't be shocked to see that either late in 2024 or early in 2025. After SaGa Frontier 2 came the most divisive SaGa game in the series, Unlimited SaGa, which released in 2002. The game went back to 7 protagonists and features the open world SaGa is known for. It also has a unique art style that looks a lot like watercolor and an aesthetic reminiscent of board games. In fact, Unlimited SaGa also had a very board game feel to it. The game was well received in Japan and sold over 500,000 copies over there. However, this game is notorious for the terrible Western reviews it saw, and is often cited by many to be one of the worst JRPGs ever made. SaGa titles generally released to very middling reviews in the West, but some of these review scores made even 7 SaGa, a bad game that's totally unrelated to the SaGa series, look like a good game in comparison. I personally thought this game was going to put the nail in the SaGa coffin, as its terrible reception could easily destroy the brand in the West. I personally remember borrowing the game from my friend, and quickly losing interest in the game when my characters were getting weaker instead of stronger after battles thanks to the game's RNG. While I didn't like Unlimited SaGa, I still had faith in the series. It wasn't until over 12 years later that the next brand new SaGa game in the series was developed, but before that, Akitoshi Kawazu developed several very good remakes. The first one was Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song, a complete remake of the first Romancing SaGa that looks and plays almost completely differently from the original game. This remake was definitely the game that rekindled my interest in the SaGa series. Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song was the West's first official exposure to the Romancing SaGa trilogy on the Super Famicom, but the game is so different from the Super Famicom version that it doesn't replace that game. The game was defined by Kawazu as being a functional compilation of the entire SaGa series. Personally, at this point in time, where SaGa Scarlet Grace is the latest game in the series I've played, I think this is also one of the best SaGa games ever made. Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song added a skill glimmer system to the original game, a ton of new weapon skills, field skills to enrich open-ended exploration, 3D graphics, a deep weapon evolving forging system, various combat modes for characters and weapons to enhance their performance in certain aspects, a ton of spells along with classes to even fuse those spells to create new ones, a class system, combination attacks among party members, and loads of tutorials to explain everything to new players. Sure, with the SaGa series though, the tutorials are only adequate at best for anybody attempting to play this bad boy of an RPG blind. I still find myself surfing mechanics and event rank FAQs on GameFAQs to get the most out of this game. While Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song wasn't received nearly as well as SaGa Frontier was in the West, it was still received much better than Unlimited SaGa. I remember a lot of people not being fans of the deformed character art style of the game and its extremely open-ended style. I personally had nothing against the deformed 3D, but I love the sprites of the original Super Famicom game. If this game gets yet another remake, I'd love to see it redone in HD 2D. Everything else about the game's presentation is stellar, including its remixed soundtrack by Kenji Ito. The game probably won back a lot of goodwill from fans like me who may have felt burned on Unlimited SaGa. I've put over 800 hours into Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song across the original game released in 2002 on the PS2 and its most recent remaster released in 2022. You know a game is good when the remake gets a remaster. To this day, I have not played a more satisfying, mechanically complex JRPG in my life than Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song. Its sheer complexity makes it a game I honestly would never recommend to anybody, but the complexity is extremely meaningful to the unique gameplay experience. If somebody asked me what the most hardcore JRPG I've ever played was in my 30 plus years of playing JRPGs, from a pure complexity, gameplay depth, and difficulty standpoint, it would definitely be Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song. Even across all those hours of gameplay, I admit I have only recently beaten one of the game's fully powered super bosses and have not yet beaten the most powerful version of the final boss, even though it's much easier to do in the remaster thanks to the additional New Game Plus features. In fact, I'll probably end up making a video on this channel at some point just about the history and differences between all versions of the original Romancing SaGa, because talking in any meaningful way about all its features is a Herculean task. SaGa 2 Hiho Densetsu, Goddess of Destiny, was the next remake of Final Fantasy Legend II developed by Kawazu and released exclusively in Japan on the Nintendo DS in 2009. I got to play the fan translation much later, and it was my first experience with the Final Fantasy Legend series. Its mechanics were about as dated as I expected from a Game Boy game, but the graphics, music, and gameplay were on point from what I came to expect from a SaGa game. I also went back to play through the Game Boy version of the game, and can say the remake, even with its new features, is very faithful to the original. I was a bit surprised this was never localized in the West, considering how popular the Final Fantasy Legends games were on the Game Boy. My experience with Final Fantasy Legends 3's remake, SaGa 3 Jiku no Hasha, Shadow or Light, was very similar. Kawazu had no involvement with the game, but it remained faithful to the Game Boy version of the game I had played through shortly after playing through this game. The time travel aspects of the story and the variety of races characters could transform into in the remake were a lot of fun, and probably because Kawazu wasn't involved, the game felt different from the others with its more detailed storytelling. Mobile games in the series were also released. Emperor's Saga shut down after 5 years and was never localized for the West. And a web browser game called Imperial Saga was also released but shut down 4 years later. Romancing Saga RE Universe is still going strong and rated quite highly on mobile devices, but I know almost nothing about that game or the other mobile games as I never played them. I will say the game has some pretty spicy art for some of my favorite characters, like the Professor from Romancing Saga 3. The most recent released new entry in the series, as of the time I'm producing this video, Saga Scarlet Grace Ambitions, came west in 2019. Kenji Ito was brought back as the game's composer. The game features 4 main protagonists, the Saga standard open world with loads of optional or missable events, magic formations, and glimmer system with many weapons to spark skills from. The world map is divided into 2D provinces, with the playable character represented in 3D. The game's open world didn't seem as fun to me to explore as other Saga games. I miss being able to simply walk around in towns and dungeons, but the battle system in this game is a lot of fun. It's a very tactical system that rewards intelligent use of weapon skills and spells for damage and status effects. Unlike most Saga games, players are actually rewarded by specializing in multiple weapons, as learned weapon skills from different weapons could unlock powerful passive skills for characters. Not only did playing as different characters change up the game, but each character also had several options within their stories that could also make multiple playthroughs with the same character worthwhile. Even releasing far more recently than Minstrel Song, I don't think Saga Scarlet Grace has evolved the formula much, but I appreciate that the game exists and it is a fresh, unique Saga experience that won't offend people even if it may not be the best game they ever played in the series. I personally only played through the game once as Urpina and enjoyed my time with it. It definitely dialed down the complexity from Minstrel Song and is more accessible than probably every other modern Saga game other than Saga Frontier. And that brings me to the new game announced in the Saga series to be released on April 25th, 2024. Saga Emerald Beyond visually looks a lot like Saga Scarlet Grace from what the announcement trailer showed. The game's description on Square Enix's website also gives strong Saga Frontier vibes. Humans, vampires, and mechs will be some of the playable characters. The game is also supposed to feature 17 different worlds with their own unique cultures, which is also reminiscent of Saga Frontier's regions. This alone should prove to be a lot more variety in the setting than Saga Scarlet Grace had with its 4 provinces. I'll have to wait to see how the game compares to all the other Saga titles, but I'm quite excited for the game and looking forward to its release. Akitoshi Kawazu held an English live stream for the game for the first time in the middle of December in 2023, and the series producer stated his goal was to promote the series more in the West, which is only a good thing for the series' sales. I have a lot of opinions on the Saga series as a whole. It's Final Fantasy's oldest spin-off series that has inspired other JRPGs from other developers like Cattle Call to create The Legend of Legacy and The Alliance Alive. I'm going to be 100% straightforward and just tell you that I think Romancing Saga 3, Saga Frontier, and Romancing Saga Minstrel Song Remastered are the best games in the series. Everything in Romancing Saga 3 just seemed to completely level up compared to its predecessors. Kenji Ito's soundtrack for this game is fantastic, with many people even today remixing or covering his songs for it. The game itself does a terrible job of explaining its mechanics, like all Saga games that depended strongly on reading the game's manual. But Romancing Saga 3's battle system has an incredible amount of depth without being too overwhelming compared to later games, and Commander Mode is one of my favorite battle mechanics in a JRPG. Akitoshi Kawazu and his team at Squaresoft really pushed the Super Famicom to its limits with this game as an end-of-generation Super Famicom title. The game is just great as it is, and doesn't really need the Minstrel Saga treatment that the first game in the trilogy got. In fact, the entire original Romancing Saga trilogy is pretty good. In Japan, this series even has stage plays designed around the games. While the series was invisible to the West in the 90s, the original games hold up well with all the rest of the 90s Golden Age RPGs that frequently inhabit JRPG top lists. That said, Saga Frontier Remastered and Romancing Saga Minstrel Song Remastered are both also peak Saga to me. Minstrel Song in particular has very complex mechanics that make it incredibly fun for those patient enough to learn it, but it can also be very frustrating for newcomers to wrap their head around. Even Saga Frontier, which I consider a very accessible Saga game, has an incredibly huge 1,558 kilobyte mechanics guide on GameFAQs that's pure text without HTML formatting. The fact that games don't come with instruction manuals anymore, and the games were made before the time of in-game tutorials, definitely doesn't help them either. Saga Frontier Remastered even added a new playable character and some nice New Game Plus features to make subsequent playthroughs more attractive. Aside from those games, I enjoyed most of the other games too. Saga Frontier 2 and Unlimited Saga are the only 2 games I personally couldn't get into, but both of these games do have their fans, and they do stand out among a group of already very unique games. The Final Fantasy Legend games on the Game Boy are mechanically much simpler except for the monster growth mechanics, which can be completely avoided by not using monsters. While I can easily recommend the remakes of Final Fantasy Legends 2 and 3, they can unfortunately only be enjoyed through Nintendo DS emulation with with a fan translation. But if emulation does not offend you, they're worth checking out. The original Final Fantasy Legend can be beaten rather casually in under 10 hours. The good news is that the collection of SaGa Final Fantasy Legend is currently available on the Nintendo Switch, Steam, Google Play, and the Apple App Store. This collection includes the original Game Boy version of all 3 games digitally. If you can get past the datedness of Game Boy era game design, the games are a fun and early look at the successors to Final Fantasy II. Personally, I think all 3 games are better than Final Fantasy II as well. The original Final Fantasy Legend was Nintendo Power's 3rd best Game Boy game of 1990. I was personally able to enjoy these games, even playing them for the first time in the late 2010s, but I also have the patience of a stinky old 90s gamer. One thing I recommend to anybody playing any SaGa game for the first time is to go online and read a beginner's guide for whatever SaGa game you decide to play before you start the games. Especially if you're playing any game that came before SaGa Frontier. Those games were developed with the assumption that players would read the instruction manuals to the games to learn important basic things like how your formations get ruined when you dash into enemies. And unfortunately, even the localized remasters don't come with instruction manuals since they were brought west so late. I've always thought having a great battle system was one of the most important things in a JRPG, since it's usually the gameplay loop players will spend the most time with in the game. I think that's one of the reasons I got so hooked on these open-ended SaGa games that emphasize challenge and in-battle events like glimmering new skills. Battle designers don't get talked about much in JRPGs, despite being such a huge part of the gameplay experience in these games. Ever since Akitoshi Kawazu's work as a battle designer in Final Fantasy II, he's been creating these systems in SaGa games, and he's probably been working at Square Enix longer than just about everybody else at the company. These games to me are all about getting wrecked in fights, but then sparking beautiful game-changing skills like Guan Yin, Rosario Impale, or Kaleidoscope, or exploiting money-making or item-obtaining mechanics to get multiple copies of powerful items. It's very easy to get destroyed in these games. It's also very satisfying and very possible to surmount unsurmountable challenges by locking enemies much stronger than you in status ailments like stun as you wail on them. Seeing your character slowly grow from little scrunchlings to god-slaying heroes is extremely satisfying. I've already posted a lengthy deeper dive into Romancing SaGa 3, which I've linked below in the description section if you're interested in seeing more of that game through the lens of a playthrough. And I'll very likely be covering other games in this series in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.